Welcome to Glisso English. Real life stories.
Have you ever felt like everyone was watching you, judging your every move? Imagine this. You are at a beautiful park. Suddenly, your child begins to scream, cry, and hit. Every single parent turns around. You can feel their burning stares. Your heart races. You want the ground to open up and swallow you whole. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we are diving into a powerful, real-life story about public meltdowns, parental guilt, and the harsh judgment of strangers. As you listen to this emotional story, you will naturally pick up everyday English vocabulary, useful idioms, and natural expressions to help improve your listening and speaking skills. Make sure to listen until the very end to see how this parent survives the playground gaze. And don't forget to check the description below for the full vocabulary breakdown. Let's begin Chapter 1. The Spark in the Sandbox. It was a beautiful sunny Tuesday afternoon. The local park was filled with the cheerful sounds of children laughing and playing. David sat on a wooden bench watching his 5-year-old son, Leo, play in the sandbox. For the first 20 minutes, everything was perfect. Leo was building a tall castle, happily scooping up the dry sand with a bright red plastic shovel. David took a deep breath, finally relaxing after a long, stressful week at work. He smiled, thinking how peaceful the afternoon was. Suddenly, the peace shattered. A slightly older boy walked into the sandbox and reached for the red shovel. He did not mean to steal it, he just wanted to share. But to Leo, this was an emergency. Instantly, a switch flipped inside Leo's mind. He let out a sharp, piercing scream that echoed across the entire playground. Before David could even stand up, Leo threw a handful of sand directly into the other boy's face. Then Leo lost complete control. He threw himself backward onto the ground, kicking his legs violently and screaming at the top of his lungs. David's heart dropped instantly. A heavy weight settled deep in his stomach. He rushed over to the sandbox, his boots sinking into the sand. He knelt down next to his son, his hands shaking slightly. "Leo, buddy, it's okay. Take a deep breath," David whispered, trying to keep his own voice calm and steady. But Leo could not hear him. The beautiful afternoon was gone, replaced by sudden, overwhelming chaos. Leo's screaming grew louder, slicing through the warm afternoon air. He began to thrash around wildly, his tiny fists striking the wooden edge of the sandbox. David felt a sudden sharp wave of heat rush up his neck and color his cheeks. The cheerful sounds of the playground had completely vanished, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. David did not even have to look up to know what was happening. He could physically feel the weight of dozens of eyes locking onto him. Slowly, he glanced around the park and his stomach tightened into a painful knot. On a nearby bench, 2 mothers stopped talking, their faces tight with disapproval as they whispered to each other. A father standing by the swings shook his head slowly, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. Even the older children had stopped playing, staring at the chaotic scene with wide, curious eyes. The burning judgment of the crowd felt heavy and suffocating, filling the open air like thick smoke. David felt exposed, as if he were standing alone on a bright stage, failing a test in front of a critical audience. He could practically hear the unspoken thoughts of the strangers surrounding him. They were wondering why he couldn't control his own child. They were assuming he was a bad father who didn't discipline his son properly. "Come on, Leo, let's go," David muttered, his voice cracking slightly under the intense pressure. He reached out to scoop his son up, but Leo twisted away fiercely, screaming even louder.
the invisible wall of isolation grew taller, cutting David off from the rest of the world.
The situation was completely out of hand, and David knew they had to escape. He could no longer think straight with 50 pairs of eyes burning into his back. Bracing himself, David leaned down and firmly wrapped his arms around his thrashing son. Leo reacted instantly, crying out and kicking his legs wildly in protest. One of Leo's small tennis shoes struck David hard in the shin, sending a sharp jolt of pain up his leg. David winced but held on tight, lifting the heavy, twisting boy into the air. As he stood up, Leo violently reached backward, accidentally knocking David's glasses right off his face. The glasses tumbled into the grass, but David could not stop to pick them up. He began to walk quickly toward the parking lot, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Behind them, a trail of their belongings lay scattered across the park. Leo's blue water bottle and a small stuffed bear remained forgotten next to the sandbox. David kept his eyes locked straight ahead, refusing to look at the parents who stepped aside to let him pass. Every step felt like a mile as Leo continued to scream and pull at David's shirt. Finally, they reached the car, and David unlocked the doors with trembling fingers. He carefully but quickly strapped his sobbing, exhausted son into the car seat. Closing the heavy car door, David leaned his forehead against the cool glass of the window and closed his eyes. The thick, heavy silence of the car finally cut off the sounds of the outside world. But inside David's head, the echoing judgment of the playground crowd refused to quiet down.
David sat in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He started the engine, and the low hum of the car filled the small space. In the back seat, the violent storm had finally passed, leaving only a soft, shaky quiet. Leo let out a few last trembling sighs before his eyes closed, completely exhausted from the meltdown. David put the car in drive and slowly pulled out of the parking lot, heading down the quiet suburban streets. The drive home was completely silent, without any music or conversation to distract him. Inside David's mind, however, the noise was absolutely deafening. He replayed the entire playground scene over and over again like a painful movie. He remembered the exact look of disgust on the other father's face and the sharp whispers of the mother's. A heavy cloud of guilt settled over him, making it hard to take a deep breath. He began to question every single choice he had made as a parent over the past few years. Was he too soft on Leo, or was he being too strict? Did he fail to teach his son how to share properly, or was something else deeply wrong? He looked at his peaceful, sleeping son in the rearview mirror and felt a profound sense of failure. To the rest of the world, it looked like he simply could not handle his own child. As he turned onto their street, the familiar houses offered no comfort or relief. The physical struggle at the park was over, but the heavy emotional burden was just beginning.
David parked the car in the driveway and gently carried his sleeping son inside the house. He laid Leo down on his bed, carefully pulling the soft blanket up to his chin. Walking down the hallway, David finally stepped into the quiet safety of the living room. He collapsed onto the couch, buried his face in his hands, and took a long, shaky breath. An hour later, Leo woke up and walked into the kitchen, looking completely refreshed. He sat down at the small table and began coloring a picture of a dinosaur, humming a happy tune. It was amazing how quickly a child could recover from a massive emotional storm. But for David, the heavy emotional hangover from the playground was still lingering. Every time Leo dropped a crayon or made a sudden movement, David's heart jumped with anxiety. He sat at the kitchen counter, restlessly scrolling through his phone to distract his mind. On his social media feed, he saw photos of other families smiling together at beaches and parks. They looked so perfect, so calm, and so completely effortless. David locked his phone and tossed it onto the counter, feeling more isolated than ever before. The walls of his own home felt incredibly small, like a hiding place from the outside world. He looked over at Leo, who was happily showing off his bright green dinosaur drawing. David smiled back, but deep inside, a dark fear was beginning to grow. He realized he was absolutely terrified of taking his son out in public ever again.
The phone on the counter buzzed loudly, breaking the quiet afternoon atmosphere. David picked it up and saw his sister's name flashing on the screen. He hesitated for a moment before answering, his voice sounding tired and flat. Within minutes, he found himself explaining the awful disaster at the playground. His sister listened, but she immediately jumped in with a list of simple solutions. "You just need to be firmer with him, David," she said confidently over the line. "If you don't use strict timeouts, he will never learn to respect boundaries." David sighed softly, rubbing his aching temples as her words poured out. Later that evening, he spent hours searching the internet for articles about childhood behavioral issues. He read endless pages written by experts offering perfect textbook advice. They talked about charting rewards, using calm language, and creating strict daily routines. None of the articles seemed to understand the chaotic reality of a real-life public meltdown. They made it sound so easy, as if parenting were a simple math equation to solve. The advice felt like a heavy trap, making David feel even more incompetent and confused. He knew his son was not acting out just to be mean or difficult. Leo was genuinely overwhelmed by big emotions he did not know how to express. But the rest of the world only saw a naughty child and an unsuccessful father. David hung up his phone and looked out the dark window, feeling completely misunderstood by everyone. An entire week passed, and the walls of the house were beginning to feel like a prison. Leo had endless energy, bouncing a tennis ball against the living room wall and pacing restlessly. David knew he could not keep his son hidden away from the world forever. Deep down, he knew that avoiding the outside world would only make the fear grow stronger. On Sunday morning, David took a deep breath and grabbed Leo's small blue backpack from the hook. "Come on, Leo, let's go find a new park to explore today," David said, forcing a brave smile. They drove out of their neighborhood, bypassing the crowded local park where the disaster had happened. David drove a few miles further to a smaller, quieter playground tucked behind an old elementary school. As he pulled into the empty gravel parking lot, David's hands began to sweat against the steering wheel. His chest felt tight, and his heart began to pound with a familiar, anxious rhythm. He looked through the windshield, scanning the area like a soldier entering a dangerous zone. There were only 3 other families scattered across the grass, which made David feel a tiny bit better. He unbuckled Leo, who immediately dashed toward the small plastic slide with a happy shout. David walked slowly behind him, his body tense and his muscles ready for a sudden emergency. Every single nerve in his body was on high alert, waiting for the next spark to ignite. He sat down on the very edge of a wooden bench, refusing to truly relax or let his guard down. He was facing his biggest fear, determined to give his son a normal childhood despite his own panic. For nearly 40 minutes, the quiet afternoon was peaceful and completely without trouble.
Leo happily climbed up the metal ladder and slid down the blue plastic slide over and over again. But as the sun began to dip below the trees, David knew it was time to head home. He walked over to the play structure, keeping his voice soft and non-threatening. 5 more minutes, Leo, then we need to go home for dinner, David said gently. Instantly, the happy expression vanished from Leo's face, replaced by a dark, familiar storm. "No, I don't want to go," Leo shouted, his voice rising dangerously as he backed away. David felt a cold splash of absolute panic hit his chest as the old fear rushed back. Leo threw himself onto the wood chips, kicking wildly and screaming at the top of his lungs. David noticed a mother nearby turn her head quickly, her eyes locking onto the loud commotion. Instead of rushing in to grab Leo and run away, David forced himself to stop and close his eyes. He took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool air steady his racing heart. He realized he could not control the people watching, but he could control his own reaction. David knelt down in the dusty wood chips, dropping directly to his son's eye level. He did not raise his voice, nor did he try to pull Leo off the ground by force. "I know it is hard to leave the park, buddy, and it is okay to feel angry," David said calmly. He completely turned his back to the rest of the playground, ignoring the world around them. For the first time, David wasn't managing a public embarrassment, he was simply helping his son through a difficult moment.
Leo continued to scream, but the wild thrashing slowly began to lose its intense energy. David remained kneeling in the wood chips, keeping his body calm and his posture relaxed. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the ground, and David felt his muscles instantly tighten up again. He braced himself for a harsh comment or a judgmental look from a stranger. Looking up, he saw a tall man wearing a faded baseball cap standing a few feet away. The man was holding a blue water bottle that had slipped out of Leo's side pocket during the struggle. Instead of looking angry or disgusted, the stranger offered David a warm, understanding smile. "I think your little guy dropped this," the man said, his voice quiet and completely friendly. David reached out and took the bottle with a trembling hand, feeling completely caught off guard. "Thank you," David muttered softly, his eyes dropping to the ground in embarrassment. The stranger did not walk away. Instead, he let out a soft, sympathetic chuckle. "Don't worry about it at all, man," the stranger said, gesturing toward a boy playing by the swings. "My oldest son used to have identical meltdowns at this exact age every single time we left the house. It is incredibly tough, but you are handling this beautifully. You are doing a great job." Those simple, kind words hit David like a wave of warm water, melting the icy knot in his chest. He felt a sudden rush of emotion rise up in his throat, making it difficult to speak. The heavy wall of isolation that had trapped him for weeks crumbled away in a single second. He was not a bad father, and he was definitely not alone in this difficult journey. The stranger nodded kindly, turned around, and walked back to join his own family across the field. David looked down at Leo, whose crying had finally slowed down to soft, quiet sniffles. For the first time in a very long time, David felt a deep sense of peace return to his heart. A month later, David sat on a park bench, holding a warm cup of coffee in his hands. The afternoon sun was bright, casting long, peaceful shadows across the green grass. A few yards away, Leo was happily playing with a group of children, sharing his toy trucks without any trouble.
Meltdown still happened from time to time because raising a child was never a perfectly smooth path, but the heavy, suffocating fear that used to trap David inside his own house was completely gone. He had learned to stop looking at the playground as a courtroom where he was constantly being judged. He no longer measured his value as a father by the opinions of strangers who did not know his life. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing cry echoed from the opposite side of the playground near the swings. A young mother was standing over her toddler who was screaming loudly and throwing fistfuls of grass. David watched as the mother's face instantly turned bright red with panic and intense embarrassment. She looked around the park with wide, anxious eyes, bracing herself for the cold judgment of the crowd. A couple of nearby parents stopped talking, turning their heads to stare at the noisy commotion with tight lips. David felt a familiar ache in his chest, remembering exactly how heavy that lonely moment could feel. He stood up from his bench, set his coffee cup down, and walked calmly across the open grass. As he approached, he picked up a small pink shoe that the little girl had kicked off into the dirt. He stepped up next to the stressed mother and handed her the shoe, offering a gentle, reassuring smile. "Don't worry at all," David said softly, keeping his voice warm and completely free of judgment. "We have all been there before. You are doing a wonderful job." The mother looked up, her shoulders instantly dropping as a look of immense relief washed over her face. David nodded kindly, turned around, and walked back to his bench to watch his son play. He smiled, realizing he was no longer afraid of the playground. He was exactly where he belonged.
That was the end of our story. Real-life problems do not always have quick or perfect solutions. But as David learned, changing how we look at a problem can change our entire life. Growth takes time, both for parents and for children. I hope David's journey reminded you that you are never alone in your daily struggles. Now let's take a look at some of the key vocabulary and idioms we use today. Did you notice the expression "caught off guard" or the phrase "on high alert"? Make sure to scroll down to the description below to find the full vocabulary list. If you enjoyed this story and want to improve your English listening skills every week, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below sharing a time you felt judged in public, or just say hello. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next story. Goodbye.